At precisely 5 a.m. on the 24th of December 2025, while the rest of Britain lay nestled in the quiet depths of a freezing Christmas morning, a single, sharp sliver of light pierced through the windows of the private archives at Windsor Castle. Prince William, driven by a quiet, persistent need to finalize the organization of his grandmother's Queen Elizabeth II final legacy, accidentally moved a heavy mahogany chest. Tucked behind a series of diplomatic ledgers sat a deep red envelope, its wax seal still unbroken, embossed with the chilling words, "Personal Directive, Top Secret, for the Sovereign's heir only." This was no polished press release or a sanitized statement drafted by a committee of spin doctors. It was a secret directive that had been buried for years, a document with the raw power to shatter the very foundations of the modern Windsor monarchy. The moment William broke the wax seal, he wasn't just opening a letter. He was dismantling a carefully constructed lie that the palace had spent decades protecting. The directive revealed the Queen's final, hidden fail-safe plans for Harry, the grandson who had famously walked away from the system to seek a new identity in America. William stood frozen, his face pale and eyes sharp, as he read his grandmother's firm, unmistakable handwriting. Elizabeth II had not just left a message of affection. She had designed a brutal legal and financial survival strategy. It was a cold-blooded survival test meant to govern Harry's future and determine whether the crown could truly survive the fractures within its own bloodline. The silence in the archive room felt heavy, almost predatory, mirroring the strategic silence the palace had used to shield the family's image from the public eye for so long. But now, as the mask fell away, William realized that everything he thought he knew about Harry's departure, about the negotiations, the supposed olive branches, and the Queen's silent grace was merely a performance. This directive was a verdict. It was a confession from an institution that had always prioritized the stability of the crown over the emotional honesty of its members. William looked out toward the mist-covered grounds of Windsor, realizing that the monarchy doesn't just manage people, it manages the perception of millions. And that is exactly where the crisis of trust begins. Did Harry know about this? Or was he, too, just another pawn in a high-stakes game of survival that the Queen had rigged to ensure the crown's endurance at any cost? The answers were buried deeper in the pages ahead, where every word acted as a surgical incision into the heart of the royal family's deepest secrets. As the dawn light grew stronger outside the Windsor archives, the weight of the document in William's hands seemed to double. The directive was not merely a set of instructions, it was a complex legal architecture, a 40-year fail-safe, meticulously crafted by Elizabeth II's most trusted solicitors. The Queen, known for her stoicism, had hidden a side trust within her private estate, one that would only activate upon the 40th birthdays of both her grandsons. With Harry having turned 40 inches September 2024, the invisible gears of this secret mechanism had finally begun to turn, triggering an audit that the palace's modern PR machine was never supposed to see. The directive laid out a staggering financial contingency. Queen Elizabeth had set aside a private sum, separate from the Duchy of Cornwall or the sovereign grant, intended as a life raft for a royal family member who chose to live outside the institutional walls. It was a cold acknowledgement that the spare might find the burden of the crown intolerable. But this was no unconditional gift. The Queen had attached 3 temporal beneficiary requirements that acted as a psychological mirror, forcing the recipient to face the consequences of their choices. The first requirement was purely logistical, but the second was deeply emotional. The beneficiary had to maintain a documented connection to the late Queen's core values of service and duty, even in exile. However, it was the third condition, Clause 7b, that caused the heir to leave William's lungs. It stated, in precise, clinical English, that the funds would be permanently forfeited if either brother engaged in sustained public disparagement of the other or the institution. The Queen had foreseen the fractures of 2020. She had anticipated the interviews, the memoirs, and the documentaries. She had built a financial incentive for silence and a legal penalty for betrayal. To William, it felt like a trap set 3 decades ago, a test of loyalty where the prize was a fortune, and the cost was the truth. William leaned back against the cold stone wall, the papers crinkling in his grip. He realized that his grandmother had not been a passive observer of their sibling rivalry. She had been its ultimate architect, hedging her bets against the very collapse he was now witnessing. If Harry were to claim this inheritance, he would have to admit that his public criticisms were a mistake, effectively silencing his narrative for a price. If William withheld the information, he would be betraying the Queen's final command. Every word on the page was a surgical strike against the brothers' already shattered bond, proving that in the game of crowns, even a grandmother's love is governed by the cold, hard logic of institutional survival. Standing in the dimly lit archive, William felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air. As he turned to the third page of the directive, he realized he wasn't just reading a legal document. He was looking into the mind of a woman who had spent 70 years mastering the art of institutional survival. Queen Elizabeth II had played a long game, one that transcended her own lifetime. She had understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the greatest threat to the monarchy wasn't republicanism or external scandal. It was the internal combustion of the spare. The directive revealed that she had been bankrolling Harry's potential exit long before Megxit was even a whisper in a tabloid. She had essentially insured the crown against her own grandson's unhappiness. But the brilliance of the Queen's strategy lay in its cruelty. By creating a multi-million-pound trust, conditioned on mutual respect, she had turned her grandsons into each other's keepers. For William, the realization was a physical blow. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a symptom of the high-altitude stress he had carried since his mother's death. In the language of physiognomy, the deep lines etched around his eyes and the set of his jaw were the physical map of a man who had become a prisoner of his own duty. He saw now that the Queen had seen this coming, the interviews, the spare memoir, the Netflix fallout, and she had provided a golden cage as a remedy. The secret directive forced William to confront a devastating moral question. Was his silence over the past 4 years a sign of dignity, or was it a calculated move to ensure he remained the clean heir in the eyes of his grandmother's ghost? If he revealed this document to Harry now, he would be handing Harry the very life raft he needed to stay independent of the palace forever. But if he kept it hidden, he would be guilty of the exact same institutional secrecy that Harry had used to justify his departure. The Queen had placed William in a sovereign's trap, where to be a good king, he might have to be a bad brother. Every paragraph of the directive was a surgical strike against the concept of a normal family. It proved that in the Windsor household, even a grandmother's foresight was a tool of statecraft. William realized that the Queen had not just loved them, she had managed them. She had anticipated that the bond between the brothers would fracture under the weight of the crown, and she had built a financial failsafe to ensure that when the crash happened, the institution would be the one left standing. As William stared at his grandmother's signature, he understood the true cost of the crown. It was a system that demanded the sacrifice of the heart to preserve the sanctity of the throne. As the clock struck 6 a.m. at Windsor, William realized that the document in his hands was more than a family secret. It was a ticking time bomb for his father's reign. The secret directive created a profound accountability gap between the era of Elizabeth II and the era of Charles III. While Charles had spent his first 2 years on the throne attempting to slim down the monarchy and project an image of transparency, this hidden trust proved that the foundation of the house was still built on the old bricks of shadow diplomacy and strategic concealment. William could see the tectonic plates of the monarchy shifting. The past was no longer a silent memory. It had become an active, legal participant in the present crisis. The directive contained a specific clause regarding the timing of disclosure. It mandated that the trust's existence be revealed to the sovereign only during a period of institutional instability. This choice of words was a chilling testament to the Queen's realism. She had known that the transition from her reign to Charles's would be the monarchy's most vulnerable moment. By withholding the trust's activation until Harry turned 40 inches late, 2024, she had effectively bypassed Charles's early authority, ensuring that the Harry problem would remain a dormant virus that would only activate when the new king was at his most stretched. To William, this felt like a silent coup from beyond the grave, a grandmother ensuring that her vision of family discipline remained the final word, regardless of who sat on the throne. William's physical reaction was becoming more pronounced. The physiognomy of stress was etched into the tight lines of his forehead. He felt the crushing weight of the sovereign's debt. He was now the only person standing between the palace's public narrative of moving on and the devastating reality of this hidden leverage. If he brought this to his father, King Charles, he would be forced to witness the king's own sense of betrayal, knowing that his mother had kept a multi-million-pound contingency plan secret from him for decades. The queen had trusted the archives more than she had trusted her own heir. The realization that the monarchy was a machine of perception rather than a family was now undeniable. William understood that every decision made since 2020, the stripping of titles, the eviction from Frogmore Cottage, the public Cold War had been played out in a theater where the most important script was hidden in this red envelope. The directive didn't just govern Harry's money, it governed the very legitimacy of the Windsor name. William stood in the center of the archive, a man caught between the ghost of a queen who prioritized the crown and a father who was trying to save a family. He was no longer just the Prince of Wales. He had become the sole guardian of a truth that could either save the monarchy from its own lies or bury it under the weight of its own secrets. The air in the Windsor archive grew thinner as William turned to the section labeled Appendix D, the Spencer Precedent. His breath hitched. Here, in the crisp, elegant script of Elizabeth II, was a direct reference to his mother, Diana. The Queen had not simply created a new trust, she had strategically integrated the lessons of 1992, 1997 into the very fabric of this secret directive. It was a cold, clinical analysis of the Diana era, not as a period of grief, but as a period of unmanaged institutional risk. The Queen had noted that the monarchy's near collapse in the 92nds was due to a lack of financial and narrative control over a disaffected spouse. She was determined that history would not repeat itself with a disaffected spare. William's jaw tightened, a physical manifestation of the protector's burden he had carried since age 15. He realized that the Queen had used the residual growth from Diana's own estate to seed this hidden trust. She had taken his mother's legacy, the very money intended to provide for her son's independence, and weaponized it. By tying the release of these funds to the non-disparagement clause, the Queen had effectively used Diana's love to build Harry's cage. It was a masterpiece of legacy management. To Harry, the money would look like a gift from his mother, but the fine print was a gag order written by his grandmother. This was the tu hoyt kam shuk, emotional death point of the entire document. William saw the devastating psychological trap. If Harry accepted the money to fund his life in California, he was essentially allowing the palace to buy his silence using his own mother's inheritance. It was a brilliant, albeit heartless, move to neutralize Harry's narrative without the palace ever having to fire a single PR shot. The Queen had understood that Harry's greatest desire keyword was independence, and she had provided it, but only at the cost of his desire to speak his truth. William felt a wave of nausea. He saw the physiognomy of betrayal in his own reflection in the darkened window. For years, he had defended the Queen's stoic silence as a mark of grace. Now, he saw it as the ultimate cloak for a surgical strike against his brother's autonomy. He was no longer just looking at a will. He was looking at the blueprints of a family civil war that had been engineered before it even began. The Queen had transformed Diana's tragic end into a sovereign's failsafe, ensuring that even in death, the Princess of Wales's resources would be used to keep the crown intact, even if it meant breaking the spirit of the son she loved most. As the morning light grew colder, William discovered a small, handwritten memo clipped to the back of the directive. It was from Sir Edward Young, the Queen's former private secretary and the architect of her most guarded legal strategies. The memo, dated 1998, provided the institutional rationale for why the trust would only activate when Harry turned 40. It wasn't a random age of maturity, The memo described it as the maturity of resentment. The Queen's legal team had analyzed decades of royal history and concluded that the spare usually reaches their point of maximum volatility and public rebellion between the ages of 35 and 40. This trust was a calculated narrative insurance policy, designed to hit Harry at the exact moment he would be most desperate for financial independence and most likely to weaponize his story. William's jaw tightened. In the world of royal statecraft, there were no coincidences, only contingencies. He realized that his grandmother had treated Harry's life like a predictable mathematical curve of rebellion. The physiognomy of calculation was evident in every line of the attorney's notes. The Queen hadn't just been a grandmother. She was a chief risk officer managing a centuries-old brand. The trust was intended to be a silent anchor, something that would weigh Harry down just as he tried to sail away into the Californian sunset. If Harry knew that a multi-million-pound fortune was waiting for him at 40, provided he remained silent, would he have ever written spare? Or did the palace's failure to disclose this early lead to the very disparagement the Queen was trying to prevent? This was the moral paradox that now gripped William. By keeping the trust a secret until the audit of 2024, the palace had essentially allowed Harry to fail the test before he even knew he was taking it. William saw the cold, institutional genius behind it. The Crown didn't just want Harry's silence, it wanted the legal right to withhold his inheritance if he became a threat. By waiting until both brothers were 40, the Queen had ensured that the test of brotherhood would happen when the stakes were at their highest, when both men had families, mortgages, and global brands to protect. Standing in the silence of the archive, William felt the weight of the sovereign. He saw his grandmother's ghost not as a figure of comfort, but as a master of information asymmetry. She had held all the cards, and she had passed the deck to William. He now had the power to either forgive Harry's disparagement and grant him the funds, or to follow the letter of the secret directive and permanently strip his brother of his Spencer-Windsor legacy. The Queen had given William a weapon, but in doing so, she had robbed him of the one thing he wanted most: a simple relationship with his brother, free from the cold, calculating shadow of the Crown. As the clock struck 7 a.m. at Windsor, William turned to the final appendix of the secret directive. His breath stopped. He didn't find the names of high-ranking political advisors or veteran royal lawyers. Instead, one name appeared clear, cold, and haunting: Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Queen Elizabeth II had not just left this directive for her heir. She had strategically appointed Catherine to be the silent guardian of this entire endgame. William realized with a physical shock that his most trusted confidant, the woman who had stood by him through every personal and public storm, had held this secret long before he ever laid eyes on it. The Queen's private notes explained the brutal logic behind choosing Catherine over Charles. In Elizabeth II's sharp institutional worldview, Charles was too compromised by a father's fluctuating emotions, while William was fueled by the righteous, often blinding fury of a betrayed brother. Only Catherine, possessing what the Queen described as the physiognomy of persistence and a profound understanding of palace discipline, was deemed stable enough to hold the key to Harry's life raft. Catherine had been tasked with observing Harry's every move from a distance, auditing every interview, every documentary, and every chapter of his memoir to determine exactly when the forfeiture clause would be officially triggered. This truth acted as the ultimate palace twist, striking at the very heart of a royal marriage that the world considered perfect. William recalled Kate's distant gazes during recent family crises and the specific moments she remained silent while he vented his frustrations about Harry's disloyalty. He realized now it wasn't simple empathy. It was the quiet observation of an institutional executor carrying out the Queen's final will. William felt a bitter, freezing betrayal of trust. In this machine of power, even his most intimate relationship had been repurposed into a tool of control. The Queen had transformed Catherine into a sentinel of the Crown, a woman whose primary duty was to restrain William's own emotional weakness should he ever attempt to reconcile with Harry prematurely. William stood alone in the archive, feeling the emotional death point of his private life bleeding out. He realized that for 27 years, The Queen had woven an invisible web of control that not even death could break. Catherine was no longer just his wife. She was the final, unyielding link in Elizabeth II's strategy of institutional preservation. The question was no longer whether Harry would receive his millions, but whether William's marriage could survive the revelation of Catherine's role as the secret guardian. Every line in the directive was a death sentence for William's last naive belief in family bonds, confirming a devastating reality. At the peak of power, truth is the most expensive luxury of all. Leaving the archives with the secret directive clutched in his hand, Prince William walked through the hollow, freezing corridors of Windsor Castle. The pale winter sun offered no warmth to the fury simmering beneath his skin. When he finally pushed open the doors of Adelaide Cottage, Catherine was already there, sitting motionless by a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The moment their eyes met, no words were necessary. The red envelope in William's hand was the ultimate evidence of the greatest rupture in a marriage that had, until this moment, been the global symbol of royal stability. William looked at his wife, and in the physiognomy of endurance etched across her face, he saw a terrifying composure. There were no explanations, no apologies. She looked at the red envelope as if looking at a destiny that had been written before they even met. William realized that in the royal machine, privacy is nothing more than a carefully curated illusion. Even between husband and wife, there was always a third entity present, the crown. Catherine began to speak, her voice low and as sharp as a surgical blade. "I didn't keep this secret because I wanted to betray you. I kept it because it was the only way to protect you from yourself." This revelation struck directly at William's tout quotidien, his core pride. Queen Elizabeth II had not trusted him enough to hold this key, knowing he would act out of raw, blinding resentment toward Harry. Instead, she had bypassed the heir to choose Catherine as a cold-blooded sentinel, a woman capable of discarding personal affection to execute the survival strategy of the House of Windsor. Catherine revealed that for years, every piece of advice she had given him to remain silent or to ignore Harry's provocations was actually part of a preset management protocol established by the late Queen. William stood there, feeling like a pawn trapped by the two most powerful women in his life. On one side, a deceased grandmother with a vision so far-reaching it felt predatory. On the other, the wife he had trusted implicitly, now revealed as a high-level risk manager. This confrontation had no screaming, only the deathly silence of a fallen faith. William understood that from this second forward, their marriage had been fundamentally altered. Catherine was no longer just his partner. She was an operative of the system, monitoring both him and his brother. The ghost of power left by Elizabeth II had not just divided two brothers. It was now systematically corroding the last remaining bond of William's heart. As the freezing December night bled into the early hours of the following day, William found himself drawn back to the cold sanctuary of the Windsor archives. The room no longer felt like a place of history. It had transformed into a courtroom where the defendant was his own brother and the judge was a ghost. He was facing what royal strategists call the martyrdom trap. According to the clinical, unyielding language of Clause 7b in the secret directive, the case against Harry was technically closed. The memoir, the global interviews, and the relentless airing of private grievances constituted a total breach of the Queen's non-disparagement condition. Legally, William held the absolute authority to sign the order of forfeiture, permanently stripping Harry of the multi-million-pound life raft his mother had intended for him. However, as William stared at the physiognomy of power reflected in his own grim expression in the archive's glass, he recognized a far more dangerous disaster looming on the horizon. If he enforced the Queen's directive and stripped Harry of his inheritance, he wouldn't just be punishing a wayward brother. He would be creating a global martyr. In the eyes of the American public and the digital generation, Harry would transition from a disaffected spare into the ultimate victim of a cold, vindictive institution that used a dead mother's money to silence her youngest son. This was the ultimate pride trap. By defending the Crown's honor and the Queen's rules, William risked destroying the monarchy's remaining moral authority in the modern world. The secret directive had effectively forced William into a sovereign's ultimatum. If he showed mercy and released the funds despite Harry's blatant betrayals, he would be admitting that the Queen's final commands were negotiable, thereby weakening the sanctity of the sovereign's word for all future generations. But if he acted as the architect of punishment, he would be handing the Sussexes the ultimate weapon for a new wave of anti-royalist sentiment. William realized that his grandmother had not just left him a financial legacy, she had left him a narrative prison. He was now the sole guardian of a secret that, if leaked, would prove the monarchy was still a machine of shadow contracts and psychological warfare, even in the era of transparency. In the heavy silence of the archive, William began to understand the true, terrifying meaning of the secret guardian. Catherine's role wasn't just to watch Harry. It was to witness William's own transition from a brother into a king who could make the unthinkable choice. The fracture in his marriage was the collateral damage of a system that demanded absolute loyalty to the institution above all human connection. William looked at the final signature line on the audit document. His pen hovered over the paper, a single stroke that could either end the Cold War with Harry or ignite a fire that would burn down the House of Windsor from the inside out. He realized that the Queen's final gift was actually her most brutal test, to see if her heir had the stomach to be as ruthless as the crown required, even if it meant losing the last shred of his own soul in the process. As the first bells of Christmas Day rang out across Windsor, Prince William sat at the mahogany desk, the secret directive lying before him like an open wound. He had reached the terminal point of the Queen's final game. In his hand was the pen that could execute Clause 7b, ending Harry's financial link to the Spencer-Windsor legacy forever. But as he looked at the signature line, William realized the terrifying brilliance of his grandmother's ultimate trap. If he signed, he became the cold executioner the institution demanded. If he didn't, he betrayed the sovereign's command. However, there was a third path, one that the machine had not fully accounted for. William looked at Catherine, who stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the gray morning light. He realized that the Queen's choice of Catherine as the silent guardian was not just to monitor Harry, but to test William's own capacity for leadership. Signing the paper would prove he was a king, but refusing to sign might prove he was a leader capable of breaking the cycle of institutional trauma. William made his decision. He did not sign the forfeiture. Instead, he took the red envelope and locked it within his personal safe, choosing to hold the secret as a private leverage, a nuclear option that he would only reveal to Harry in a face-to-face confrontation, away from lawyers, cameras, and palace walls. This was the institutional reset. William understood that the monarchy could no longer survive on shadows and hidden contracts. By choosing to handle the directive as a brother, rather than a sovereign, he was effectively ending the era of Elizabeth II's shadow governance and beginning the era of the transparent king. The global fallout would be slow but certain. The discovery of the directive would eventually leak, but by then, William would have already reclaimed the narrative. He was no longer a pawn in his grandmother's game. He had become the architect of a new, albeit fragile, peace. The secret directive remains the most consequential document in modern royal history. It proved that Queen Elizabeth II's love for her grandsons was always secondary to her duty to the crown. But in the cold light of December 2025, Prince William has proven that the blood in his veins matters more than the gold on his head. The monarchy is indeed shaken, but it has not fallen. As the world watches the Windsor family walk to church this Christmas morning, they see a golden couple, more united than ever. But behind their polished smiles lies the weight of a secret that has changed the crown forever. The ghost of Diana has been heard. The spirit of Elizabeth has been honored. But the future now belongs entirely to the man who dared to look into the archive and chose to be a brother first.